Ngāti he wā mauri ora ki te whaia ki te ao marama. E ngā maunga whakahi o tau ki uki rāno. E hora nei ki runga. I tamato te whenua e tū, e tū, e tū.
The sounds of an Anzac Day dawn service at the Cenotaph at Auckland Museum.
For the services and sacrifices made by so many, help us to remember those who paid the ultimate sacrifice, where their blood soaked the ground on foreign shores.
The Cenotaph is an impressive memorial with its symbolic empty coffin sitting on a stone pylon. It's an exact replica of the design in Whitehall in London. But it forms just a small part of this war memorial.
The whole building up on Pukekawa in the Auckland domain was built in two major stages, one following World War I and one following World War II. The Cenotaph is the focal point, if you like, of the actual commemorative services, but the building itself is the bigger statement around, I suppose, people's aspirations of the day that we hope the tragedy would never happen again. Now, of course, tragically, only one generation later, we were extending the building, doubling its size because World War II had happened.
This is David Reeves, the museum's Director of Collections and Research, and I'm Alexia Russell from The Detail. Together we're taking a tour of this magnificent building, talking about how we tell the stories of war, why there's been a surge in interest in those stories, and the horrific date that both our families have in common. We start outside on a blustery day where carved into the walls are names that will be familiar to any students of history, and to New Zealand drivers, because many of them are street names.
The original building, which opened in 1929, the names above the windows are the various battles in which New Zealanders were significantly involved.
So there's Ella Lane we're walking past now.
And then when the building was extended in the late 1950s, then that idea was carried on, so the battles of World War II were added above the new section. So we're standing now outside at the join between the two buildings. So
I see. Okay, so the Battle of Britain marks the join.
Yeah, so the 1929 building stops here, and then the 1959 building is the curved bit that was extended. And it's the architectural style is an interesting combination of the sort of Greek revival classical, but also fitting of the time. The just hints of modernism and Art Deco, just slightly stripped back classical motifs, and hence these sort of bas-relief figures that you see at the door portico here.
Do you think they knew at the time that this would become the iconic building in Auckland?
I think the reading I've done were absolutely aware that was the case, and in fact the architects were very keen that be the case. And that was the sentiment in Auckland too, that the hill, which had been a significant site for Māori in previous centuries, has a fantastic view over the harbour entrance and to the Maunga to the south, strategic point. And so when it was selected as the site for the War Memorial building, and also the previous Auckland Museum had outgrown its previous premises, and the two projects were combined during the 1920s.
And here is the reason why Anzac Day is on April the 25th, the Gallipoli 1915 landing, with all the names: Shrapnel Gully, Walker's Ridge, Quinn's Post, Russell's Top. That's General Andrew Russell referring to, I presume.
Yeah.
Lone Pine, etc. But is this date, the 25th of April, is it the right date? It's one battle. It wasn't the worst battle in World War I.
No, I mean, but it has become an incredibly symbolic date, and for Australian and New Zealand involvement in World War I, and it's been written about many, many times that it was the first time that New Zealand and Australia popularly were viewed as fighting together, and that landing day was the day chosen as a Memorial Day. I mean, they needed to choose a day, but of course there have been many, many other battles since and other parts of the war, but this one although its origin is in the Gallipoli landing, it has come to be New Zealand's Memorial Day and Australia's, even though the rest of the world tends to focus on November the 11th as the armistice, as the signing of the end of the war.
Because Anzac Day originated during the war, didn't it? Before the Western Front battles were fought.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
And a lot of people, and you and I have this history in common, feel that Passchendaele was by far the worst event, the 12th of October, 1917.
Well, it was certainly the single day where New Zealand lost over 800 lives in a single day, and is still the very worst day in New Zealand's history of armed conflict overseas. But there's a sense that Passchendaele was just so terrible that at the time people perhaps wanted to forget it, much to the grief of the families involved, yours and mine included.
Yes.
And I think at the beginning of the war there was probably still a great sense of adventure and possibility and doing it for the king and country thing. But by the end of the war, people were just so worn out and so despondent and just so relieved that it was over, that perhaps Passchendaele was not viewed as such a... It certainly wasn't something to celebrate.
And it's not even written in stone on this building.
That's a curiosity, that the name Passchendaele, and historian Jock Phillips has written about this a bit, why it is that we've got Versailles and Somme and other names from World War I are named, street names and the like, but Passchendaele is not.
However, the names of individual battles at Passchendaele are included. Two of the museum's architects were wounded there.
And again, this idea that maybe it was just so painful that people wanted to forget.
Or they couldn't spell it, so they said Ypres instead.
Yes.
Now, I've talked to David at the museum for a detailed podcast before, and this is how we know that his great-uncle and my great-grandfather died in the same battle on the same day. My ancestor's name is not on the walls inside the World War I sanctuary because he was from an Otago regiment. These are just Auckland names.
So there's over 4,000 names here, which obviously, if you consider that the population of New Zealand was only around 1 million at the time, so it's a very substantial percentage. A large percentage who served, and also a terrible casualty rate also.
And is this where your great-uncle is?
Yep, so the name of Charles Roland Gumbley is up in the top corner there. I'd always known that his name was here, but it was particularly poignant when I came to work here and, have the opportunity to walk past him every day. So he was 22 from Hawke's Bay. He enlisted in Auckland, which is why he's included in the Auckland roll.
The World War I sanctuary opened in 1929, and 2 years later the names were added.
And actually we have a program where from time to time, once every 3 years or so, we do a bit of a catch-up because we get notified of some misspellings in some cases. So even now, 90 years later, there are still errors and omissions which come to light. We research them thoroughly and check them against the original criteria for inclusion. And we had some extra names added last year, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just 3 or 4 names.
That had been forgotten?
Yep.
And I presume you don't correct misspellings, you just correct them on their online record?
No, we can, actually. If the stonemasons are able to, they'll do a very careful job of fixing the misspelling. Yep.
David says as time goes on, people are becoming more, not less, interested in their relatives who served, many of them spurred on by researching their ancestry. To help them in that, the museum is in charge of the nation's online cenotaph. And for a lovely story about that, listen till the end of the podcast. Heading anti-clockwise now, we pass through the stories and artefacts of the Second War, including a Spitfire plane that was craned in after the museum roof was removed, and the 25-pounder field gun of the type my grandfather operated in the Pacific. Next, you get to the other cornerstone of the War Memorial Museum, the World War II Hall of Memories. And while the sanctuary is beautiful and peaceful, I find this newer end of the building more confronting. Here we have Korea, Malaya, Borneo, Vietnam, Bosnia, Kuwait, East Timor, Afghanistan. Sadly, there's more room at the end.
And there's a panel down the other end which poignantly says, "Let these walls never be filled," which was also part of the sentiment following World War II, when the aspiration of World War I clearly hadn't worked out. So that was a very assertive statement around, let's try harder to stop this happening. The slight difference here around inclusion of names is that these names are from the whole of New Zealand, so these don't represent just Auckland. And the difference happened there was after World War II, the enlistment in the New Zealand Army was not on a regional basis, and Air Force and Navy also. So it means that people didn't have quite such a regional affiliation to their enlistment. So it means it makes more sense. And also there's thankfully a smaller number possible to put them all on one tablet.
And now we're getting to the stage where we're starting to recognise names that we heard in the news. I mean, I've done a podcast about Leonard Manning. Mm-hmm. We know about Tim O'Donnell in Afghanistan. It's coming closer.
It is. Yeah. And what's interesting, particularly when our online cenotaph work, there's part of the audience that use that are people like myself and you who have people from World War I, and there's a sort of a family history element to it. Whereas what we're finding is that there's a really strong group of service personnel who served in these more recent Vietnam and later, who are coming to the museum seeking a place to record their memories, seeking a place to be listened to, seeking a place to deposit their medals. And so we're seen by them as a trusted place to look after their memories and to respect them. And
so it's the right place.
Yeah, and the Auckland Museum occupies this odd place in being overtly public but not of the government. So it means that we can do things a little bit outside the rules sometimes, or form the rules just
you're
slightly
not tied
aside
by
from
military protocol.
That's right. Yeah. That's right, and that's not to say anything against military protocol. It has that absolutely has its purpose, but in a civil frame, sometimes there are other things going on. So the Online Centre, for example, has people who fought in the Spanish Civil War. Now, New Zealand itself didn't fight in the Spanish Civil War, but there were New Zealanders who went and fought, and the families of those men want somewhere to record those memories and to make sure that record isn't lost.
At the end of the room, under the R's, my great-uncle Jack. J.C. Russell, there he is. So he died in Italy. He was the first New Zealand soldier to die in Italy. He was a driver. He was killed by friendly fire. And here he is on the wall.
Yes.
I guess it does make you feel you have a connection with someone that you never met, but your relatives talk about him.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And taking their place on the wall amongst... And if you think that you have that reaction to one name, and here we have several thousand names around us, how many stories and resonances that represents.
Yeah, and how many interrupted lives.
Yep. Every single name has a spider's web of connections and relatives who remember them in different ways.
The Scars on the Heart exhibition is about understanding what happened in World War I and before that, and what the impact of that has been, an impact that we're still working through now. That includes the New Zealand Wars, where some serious rethinking is going on.
That gallery is actually just right now up for revision. We've done a bit of thinning out of the previous display, but our curatorial team are working on it right now, really completely rethinking how we might approach that and working with communities around New Zealand, around particularly northern New Zealand. And so what people see now will be very different from what they will see in 3 years' time when we've done a bit of work rethinking that.
Will you align it with the new school curriculum?
Yes. So that's one of the things that's driving that, but not the only one. And again, that's another display that's now getting on for 25 years old, and our thinking has changed. We'll do some adjustments in the next few months, but there's a much bigger project to completely rethink this and use different objects. And
when you say rethink, I mean, but when the museum first looked at this, there was only one half of this story essentially told.
Yeah, although we've got the two halves on the two sides of the room here, but even then, the Māori story is told by Pākehā, so it's not, we sort of went partway there, but actually we need a much greater range of voices. And I think we'll also expand this into not just what happened when and who was involved, but there's a much, much bigger story to understand about the consequences. What was the conflict all about, and sovereignty and land and dishonouring treaty obligations and so forth. And how does that persist today? What are the things today that have an origin right back in the 1860s, for example?
And here we are at the one I kind of like the most.
Here's your favourite bit.
The trenches, because I loved, when this first was built, I thought, wow, that's amazing. You can actually walk through the trenches here, sandbags on the side and a wooden floorboard
and the texture of the
rock. Yeah. And it's got, fabulous displays within it, so you sort of get the idea
and the dimmed
of what
lighting and the soundtrack.
Like. Yeah. But then you would have done this too, after going to Zonabeki and into the actual trenches that they dug up. The dampness, the mud, the very, very dim lighting, the feeling that a rat was going to run over your feet any minute. I just wonder, can any museum accurately portray how awful that was?
I think we can use various physical devices and emotive methods to evoke that, but we can never completely recreate that. It's something that this is a suggestion of what it was like, and it helps give people a sense, but the true depravity of having the no light and the smell and the mud underfoot and also World War I in particular, months and months and months and months like that. I mean, the constant rain and the constant threat of not knowing what was happening tomorrow. And the other thing about that is that it's actually in or very near the actual place that it happened. So this one is sort of diametrically on the opposite side of the earth, and people know that. So there's a bit of a suspension of disbelief that happens to
we've got the clean war.
Yeah, and so we know we're not in Belgium when you're walking through here. But the visitor feedback that we get around these displays is still very, very positive, and so it's not a priority for us to rip them out and do it again.
No, not something that needs to be fixed. And while the trenches and maybe the Spitfire are my favourite parts of the War Memorial Museum, David Reeves says some of the people who come in with a quest are what moves him the most.
And I'm thinking, for example, of a really moving story of a Japanese woman who came in a couple of years ago now, armed with a photograph of two children who were her half-siblings. So her father was a New Zealander as part of the J-Force following World War II. She never met him. He came home. Her mother raised her, but all her mother left for her was this photograph, which had been sent by the New Zealand soldier to her after the war, with his two subsequent children in the photograph. That's all she had, and she wanted us to help. And so between the team here and at Auckland Libraries, we did this extraordinary, circuitous bit of research which found the photographer of the photograph, the suburb they were in, found the school rolls, found that must have had the two given names of the children, but no surname on the back. So they went through the school rolls, found the only case where there were those two names with the same surname. She was able to come back here with the surname. We were able to look up on the online cenotaph and find her father, and she was able to go out to Waikamete Cemetery and visit his grave. And that is what moves me most. It's those stories of discovery where it's meaning making again. It's that is just so important to that woman who, and floods of tears all round actually when that finally happened. Not just the woman herself, but the staff. Just really the empathy of being able to satisfy that quest that she'd had for 40 years. Of not knowing who her father was,
quite incredible.
Able to make the trip to New Zealand, and we were able to help her find her dad's grave. I mean, it's one of the wonderful things about that online cenotaph is that it's got 264,000 service personnel in it, and there'll be different people who don't know each other who have a common connection, and so other stories where we've there's been reunification of second cousins who didn't know of each other because of perhaps family rifts or just dissociation or dislocation.
So this may come as people get used to the online cenotaph adding their own information.
That's right.
You're not worried that people add fictitious information and build up the heroics of their ancestors?
So that was one of the things when we redeveloped the database was, and the key thing was enabling people to put in their own information. And there was a big question, how do we check that it's right? And we quite quickly alighted on the idea that we wouldn't, we simply don't have the resources to check 264,000 soldiers and what people might put in. But also, we did require if people put it in, they have to say who they are, and we asked them to say what their source was, how have they come by this information. But people are incredibly respectful. There was concern about spam or desecration of the records. It hasn't happened. People just are incredibly respectful that this is a war memorial function, and everything is constructive and positive.
That's it for today. I'm Alexia Russell. The Detail is supported by the Public Interest Journalism Fund. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Sarah Robson. Thanks to David Reeves. Ka kite.